Welcome, everybody. I'm going to give a couple seconds for Zoom to let people in to connect their audio. Then we will be getting started. Quick reminder, these sessions are recorded for posterity. You can check out past sessions on our YouTube channel of Foresight. I believe they're probably also linked on the UBC website somewhere. But that's a great way to follow up on this discussion. If there's anything that's said that you forget and want to review, that's one way to get it. That also means try to keep it clean in the language department. Even in the chat, that's recorded too. Welcome to Climate Connections. This is our energy edition. This is a monthly opportunity for industry to do some reverse pitches, to tell a little bit of the things that they're looking for from early stage innovators to kind of bring the ecosystem together. I'm really always excited about these events because I get to spend a little bit more time with Shannon Bard, my wonderful partner in crime in organizing these. Next slide, please, Lee. Before we go any further, I would like to acknowledge that Foresight does operate on and respect the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people. I myself am working in Vancouver on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations. Our agenda for today, we'll have a few welcome and introductions. I'll tell you a little bit about Foresight. Shannon will tell you a little about UBC. We'll try to get that done quickly so we can move on to talking to the panelists, the reason we've all come here today to hear from them. We'll be doing that for about 50 minutes. That's going to be moderated by Shannon Bard. They will be doing a little bit of an introduction of themselves and their areas of concern. And then we'll actually move into breakout sessions. So please do stick around for that. At noon, each of the panelists will be moved into a breakout room where you can introduce yourself and ask more one-on-one questions from them. If at any time during the session you do have a question, I would highly encourage you to type it into the chat before you forget, and also so that everyone else can hear the answer. We'll then be wrapping up at 12:25. We'll come back here for some closing remarks. As always, good Zoom etiquette. If you're not planning to talk, keep yourself on mute. A little bit about Foresight. We are a not-for-profit. We are pan-Canadian, and we are trying to fuel the transformation to a green economy. What does that mean? On the next slide. It means we focus on accelerating early stage ventures. We provide them training and mentorship, the things they need to know to overcome the challenges they face, to bring their technology from an idea into a packaged product that someone can buy, fully commercialized. That's our goal. We want to help companies address global scale challenges. We also run innovation challenges with our industry partners. The most recent one, the one I like, is the Canadian Resource Innovation Networks. They had a $30 million challenge for low emission fuels and value-added products. So a lot of great funds were distributed through that specific challenge, but we've run over 49 in total and keep abreast. We're hoping to do a bunch more this year that may use your technology or you may learn something as part of. We focus on a few different areas in this. Obviously, export development, I already mentioned, ecosystem building, what we're doing here today, trying to bring together different groups, academia, industry, government, investors, and of course, innovators. And finally, capital attraction. We do realize that the industry needs money all the way from seed investments up to big commercial loans for infrastructure projects. And so trying to make that a smooth transition. Next slide. This is put on by Energy Next. This is one of the Foresight Next streams that focus on areas of clean tech. In this, we do have a focus on energy. We are partnered with our collaborators, Unique down in Houston, and we are very excited to continue our activities to support this area of Canadian innovation. I think now I will be passing it over to Shannon Bard from E at UBC to talk a little about what they do there, why we're engaged in this project together. Shannon?
Great. Thank you so much, Stephen. So I lead the Climate Venture Studio at Entrepreneurship at UBC, which is an incubator and an accelerator at the University of British Columbia. And our real focus is on how we can accelerate the deep science that's created in the universities and launch that out into the marketplace to be able to have more climate solutions that are actually getting adopted and to accelerate that process. Because historically, the time frame is about 30 years between discovery and commercialization. And we want to try to reduce that down to 5 to 10 years, knowing that we're in a climate emergency. So what we're going to be doing now, I think we're going to move on to the next slide, Lee. Oh, this is about our whole program, EUBC. But basically, what you need to know is that anyone who has a connection to UBC, including alumni, are able to take part in our programs. And we have a really strong connection with Foresight in that when teams are more mature and they need to scale, they have access to all the resources through our partners at Foresight, which is really wonderful. And we have teams that are also involved in human health and social ventures as well. And we bring communities together with mentors as well from the larger community. Thank you. Next slide, please. So now we're going to move on to our panel. One of the problems that Stephen and I really identified is that there's often a silo for deep science entrepreneurs within climate solutions, in that they don't have a lot of interactions with industry. And so we wanted to create a platform through this series of presentations where ventures and researchers would get an opportunity to hear from industry experts what are some of the most pressing environmental problems that these companies are facing, that industry is facing, and to have a chance to talk to those industry experts in the breakout sessions to be able to ask some customer discovery questions, which is what your opportunity is going to be at noon. So what we're going to do today is each of our panelists is going to be coming to talk to us a little bit about their pressing problem. So what I'd like to do is start with Joanne. We're going to move on to Jeremy and then to Nigel. And so Joanne, what I ask you to do is to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your company and what the pressing vision is for your company, and then move on to present sort of what your biggest challenges are around energy and the environment, and then move on to Jeremy and then Nigel. Go ahead, Joanne.
Hi, everybody. I work for Quidno Energy Resources as the EH&S controller. And so we have a really big focus. We're an energy transition company. So looking to add green projects to our upstream business to be able to focus on emission reductions. And so we've got a huge focus on ESG and emission reductions, but water usage, ARO, land base. We've created an ARO reserve to take care of our inactive liability. We're working on emission reductions across our whole portfolio. And one of the other challenges that we're here to talk about today is our water usage. So using fresh water for drilling and fracking operations, and how can we reduce that water usage in either new technology or in recycling of produced water, and being able to take that produced water and recycle that back and use that. And so how do we clean that to a standard that we can use at for drilling completions operations? You're on mute.
Over to you now, Jeremy. Thank you.
Thanks, Shannon. Thanks, Joanne. I'm Jeremy Olson. I'm Senior Sustainability Advisor at Federated Cooperatives Limited in Saskatoon. A little bit about our company. We're a two-tier cooperative, so we are owned by member co-ops across Western Canada, and those member co-ops are owned by the community members that are our co-op members. And so we sort of take our direction from them, and we help sort of organize and wholesale and distribute for all of our members across Western Canada. And with that said, our vision, I guess, is building sustainable communities together, and so that together is with the members of our cooperative. As far as challenges go, I mean, there's no shortage of those. For me, I think what I'll focus on today is around life cycle assessment of low carbon fuels. So where I've spent a lot of my work the last couple of years. As I'm sure most of you are aware, BC has had a low carbon fuel standard for some time, and the federal government, their regulations are coming in spring 2022. So I mean, in government speak, that's probably June 20th or whatever the last day before summer actually starts is. So we're waiting for those. They've given us some direction on the model and some, pre-publication information. And so we've been trying to model the carbon intensity of fuels that we hope to produce that will help us transition to this low carbon economy. We own and operate a refinery and an ethanol complex currently, and we just have announced plans to develop a renewable diesel facility using primarily canola as a feedstock. And so we want to understand the full life cycle picture of these fuels to be able to produce a fuel with the lowest carbon intensity possible while doing that, economically viable so we can stay in business. So there's a lot of challenges all built into that. One of them is good data. If you don't have good data, you can't have a good life cycle, picture of your fuel. And then also trying to balance that, reducing the carbon, the carbon intensity with, but also not, breaking the bank. And so those are some of the challenges that we're facing and that I sort of spend a lot of my time on. So I'll leave it there for now. Thanks, Shannon.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Jeremy. So Nigel, I'd like to pass it over to you now.
Thanks. So my name's Lars. I'm an executive in strategy and growth at Baker Hughes, and that's really my focus is to advance new energy frontiers, and they're those that, of course, will position the company to meet global energy demand, offering lower carbon solutions across industries and the energy space in general. I've got a long background in low carbon and decarbonisation and energy transition, both originating from work I did at Shell on carbon capture, use and storage. Then worked in hydrogen and alternative energy for BP, and then moved to Baker Hughes in 2019 at the launch of our net zero strategy. So we were the first in our sector to actually make a net zero commitment by 2050. And of course, part of that offer is through decarbonisation of our own operations, but also providing, of course, a whole host of decarbonisation options for our customers. And then secondly, investing for growth. And so that's the team that I work in. I'll take you through some slides later on about our specific area of interest and challenge that we're really posing today. And that's about hydrogen storage. And some of the challenges associated with that, and looking for some new ideas. So yeah, that's what I'll be speaking about later on. Thank you.
Wonderful. Actually, Nigel, why don't we use those slides? Lee, if you want to put those slides up now, I think that now would be a good time for Nigel to introduce that.
All right, will do. Okay, hopefully you can see.
Yeah, looks great. Looks great, Nigel.
All right. Okay, excellent. All right. So, so indeed, I'm part of the strategic investment group for the company, and just a little bit of background. We have got decades of industrial scale technology development capability, and we're a global company, and you can see where we've done some investments so far in the spaces I'll be speaking to you about. Is we put in about 100 million over the last year alone, and that's it, external spend into other companies. You could probably double that when it comes to our internal commitments to underpin those technologies. There's about 6 companies we've invested into, and of course the breadth of companies out there is in the thousands that we screen through and look at, range of different startups straight out of university all the way through to those that are pretty mature, ready to go to market and scale. There's 16 of us in the company. And we, of course, use our internal network of experts in order to review those options. How we work is basically we scope for those early stage companies and ideas, and this is a great opportunity for us to do that. We then put investment in, and that means not just money, but also time and commitment. And so we're a strategic investor, because what we put our time and effort into, we really want to see emerge out of a tech development pathway and into the marketplace and scale then in the marketplace. And through that, we leverage, of course, manufacturing capabilities, supply chains, and then our customer network. The areas where we invest are in CCUS, in hydrogen, in energy storage, industrial asset management, and digital solutions, and then a number of new emerging areas. To give a little bit more context about what we've invested in, and you'll see a BC company there, Akona Power. I'm the board member for our investment in Akona, which is a methane pyrolysis technology. But we've got some carbon capture technologies. Compact carbon capture is originated in Norway. Electricia is a biomethanation process originated in Germany. ICS, another Canadian company that looks at the process intensification of the absorber. Net Power is a US company, basically that has a novel power cycle for natural gas that also captures CO2. And then Mosaic is our latest investment, also in the US, in California, and that's a metal organic framework that we believe is going to be the future of direct air capture. And then lastly, Nemesis is a electrochemical cell capability, looking at several different ways to produce hydrogen through electrolysis and also have fuel cells that use hydrogen. So there are our investments to give you an idea. And we're pretty active in the whole hydrogen supply chain through these acquisitions and our existing capabilities in both the subsurface that many people will know Baker Hughes is doing, but also in the surface area and the facilities and process engineering, because when GE bought into Baker Hughes, fundamentally changed the company, and half of the company now is process turbo machinery and process systems. So that's compression and gas turbines that are applied to hydrogen, and also digital solutions. We've got about 7 different companies that are working in sensing and control systems. So in the area here to focus on, the area where we're really focusing our challenge really is around, indeed, hydrogen storage. And in summary, the challenge we see with hydrogen storage is that, of course, the hydrogen economy will need plentiful, reliable storage. The options really today that achieve low cost are geological storage through salt caverns and depleted gas fields. And of course, they don't exist everywhere. Because the hydrogen economy is growing at a rate and a breadth, that means there's lots of decentralized use of hydrogen that is going on throughout different regions. And the traditional way to store hydrogen, therefore, is in pressurized containers, but they have limited scale to about 1 ton of hydrogen per container. And so they're not really scalable. You could scale out, but scaling up the storage solution there is a limit. There's other ways that hydrogen can be stored in liquid forms, but they can be expensive in terms of capital costs, but probably more importantly in terms of the amount of energy that they consume themselves, and therefore the emissions, get into life cycle emissions analysis that Jeremy mentioned. So parasitic load's about 30%. And of course, if you put it into another form, like ammonia, hydrogen into ammonia, they can also then pose a safety risk. So our question really is, what are some new options that can effectively, from a cost, scale, safety perspective, store hydrogen? Thanks.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Nigel. So there's a couple of things that I heard going back to Joanne's presentation and Jeremy and also you, Nigel. There's a few themes that are coming out. One is finding solutions that are cost effective, so you can actually manage to implement them and adopt them in the market and in the economy. But also, I've heard you mention ESG and also life cycle analysis. So the first question I want to pose to the group is around where are you seeing the demand for this kind of sustainable, responsible sources of energy? Is it coming from the marketplace? Is it coming from the investors? Or is this a corporate culture where the company has said, we want to do the right thing? And maybe Joanne, I can ask you to start with that, since you're really embedded in the ESG and the health and safety and environment side. Oh, I think you're on mute. Go ahead.
I would say, Sean, it's depending on what piece of the ESG world we're talking about. When we're talking about emissions, I think that there's a bit of it is investment. When we talk about that piece, ARO is investment too. That, you know, our investors want to make sure that we're taking care of our assets and our inactive assets. From the water recycling is more of a company initiative. So I think we've got a little bit of both going on in our company.
Oh, Shannon, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, that seems to be plaguing our panel today. Nigel, I was just going to say that you had done a nice job of showing how your company is involved in from production to transportation to utilization. So really looking at sort of the full life cycle of this opportunity. So where do you see these pressures and demands around ESG in the marketplace, and where's that coming from?
Everywhere. I think it's the easy answer, but I'll back that up. Of course, it's policy and regulations, you know, that are shaping market pricing, but there's also parts of the market that are being really consumer-led. Mm-hmm. And some of the consumers, of course, are corporates, and to meet corporate commitments. And then I think that relates, of course, to the investment community, indeed, and of course their viewpoint of the risks associated with long-term investments because of climate change impacts, both from and of course not being the cost of adaptation, and of course the carbon potential having stranded assets. And then lastly, and actually really importantly, is our workforce. You know, societal attitudes are changing, and that includes our 70,000 people that we have in the company. And in order to keep and get new talent into the organization, these are really important areas that people also believe in and want to see us work on. So
wonderful. It's so great to hear that value proposition is getting reinforced from so many different directions. Now, Jeremy, you work for a cooperative, so you may have a slightly different perspective on this. I'd like to hear what you'd have to say.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo Nigel and Joanne. It is coming from everywhere for sure. You know, I think regulation is driving a lot of our work around low carbon fuels for sure. We have, like I mentioned, we have that refinery, and we want to maximize those assets, but also be, you know, sort of ahead of the curve in that transition to a low carbon economy, because we realize that that's, you know, time's running out on that. So there's that pressure for sure from the regulatory side, but as a cooperative, you know, we have the members that are constantly reaching out to the co-ops that they're members of, and so we sort of get that firsthand, you know, information from the members of our cooperative. And one of the really I guess one of the examples of something that was even ahead of the regulations was, I mean, and I'm sure you've all heard of it, but you know, plastics and what we're doing around plastics is a huge huge question and a huge customer touch point, because every time they go to a grocery store or a convenience store, they're getting a bag and they're like, well, what do I do with this? What are you doing about it? How can we, you know, solve this problem? And so that was something that we were internally working on already, but then the customer or our member push really accelerated the speed at which we started to try and help solve that problem. And then later on, you know, regulations have started coming in as well, you know, depending on where you live. You know, BC is probably ahead of where we are in Saskatchewan and other jurisdictions, but the customer and our member drive was something that really pushed us in that way, for sure.
Oh, very good. Well, I want to build a little bit on that, because both you and Nigel touched on the role of regulations in changing the marketplace, creating marketplaces. And Jeremy, you've also touched on that you can get pressure from your membership actually before even the regulations come into place. And so that's a challenge that we see with some of our deep science entrepreneurs, is that often the market is created often overnight. For example, you know, the banning of single-use plastics, a new market is created overnight because of a new regulation, because before you could just throw it in the garbage. Now you need to find an alternative. So one of the challenges with some of these deep science ventures is the market might not be, their timing might not be aligned with what's happening in the marketplace. But if they had better information about knowing sort of what's coming down the funnel for changes that are happening in various jurisdictions globally, that could be helpful. Maybe you can talk a little bit about, especially Nigel, because you're looking at that full kind of life cycle, as well as you, Jeremy. What advice would you give to some of these deep science entrepreneurs that right now they might have a solution for a problem that is very important in terms of greenhouse gas and sustainability, but there's not a regulatory stick that's forcing that on the market yet? How can they position themselves, especially within the framework of ESG, to be able to push for adoption for organizations like yours? And who'd like to tackle that one first?
Go ahead, Nigel.
I'll kick it off then. So yeah, it's a great question, and you know, the easiest, it's actually quite hard, but one way is indeed to look at the impact within the overall full chain, and then look at what the overall carbon price is needed for the full chain to be commercially viable. And that helps you look at alternative pathways. But in order to do that, of course, if your technology and idea, you know, is part of one pathway, you need to get a good viewpoint of the total costs and benefits within the total pathway, and then be able to compare that to alternatives. If you can do that, and really, you know, and it works within and of course, I think, you know, carbon pricing is the clearest policy, and there's overall consistency really about that. There's some variation, but you know, then you'll find a marketplace that can value it and will incorporate it. It doesn't need to be therefore a regulation for that specific technology. So yeah, how it fits into the overall pathway, and then the LCA work, of course, proven to be really important. So yeah, I'd say that's a good way to think and have a look at it. Jeremy, did you want to make a comment on that?
Yeah, I guess Nigel makes a really good point. I mean, using that, you know, right now we have a pretty good idea of what the carbon price is going to be out to, what is it, 2040 anyway, when it gets to $170 a ton. So using that to price into your projects, because there's a lot of stuff, even renewable power, that traditionally in the past might not have meet those like traditional financial metrics that the finance guys are looking for. But if you can, you know, incorporate that carbon price, then a lot of these projects might start becoming more viable, and at least you have an idea of like when in the future that is going to happen. And then you can sort of use that to be like, hey, we know right now that maybe this isn't viable, but here's the way the carbon price trajectory is going, and here's how we think we can sort of you know, get you in early and start saving you money in the future, I guess.
Joanne, would you like to contribute to this part of the conversation?
Sorry, I'm just responding to Scott there in the chat, and I kind of missed where you guys were at. I was focused on my comment.
Oh, that's okay. That's okay. I'll just summarize a little bit, and then I have some additional questions for you, Joanne. So one of the things that I heard from both Nigel and Jeremy that I think kind of sums things up is that if you can shine a light on the data and an understanding of life cycle and how you quantitatively make an impact within that life cycle, that can open up the doors to conversations about what that impact is. So really it's having some transparency about what your impact is and finding a way to quantitatively describe it within the pathways and the language and the work that your potential clients and customers are going to understand. And so that's really, really good advice for our entrepreneurs. Now, one topic that I wanted to throw back to you, Joanne, is your role includes both health and safety and environment. And when we look sort of historical at corporate culture, there was a period before the health and safety culture, about 30 years ago, and we had to have some pretty significant health and safety disasters, Bhopal, India, Seveso in Italy with the dioxin exposure, and a number of these, which transformed the workplace in health and safety. And now they're now sort of tacking environment on to the health and safety profile. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about how you see the evolution of environment playing a role as health and safety has become so entrenched within corporate culture around natural resources. What do you see the role of environment playing in that?
You know, I think environment is now in the spotlight, and for a long time, it was something that you did that you necessarily didn't throw a lot of resources at. And there's a big focus on it from your stakeholders, from your investors, internally at the companies as well. And it's become a hot topic, which is great. So, you know, companies are embedding that within their portfolios. And the governments, when we talk about regulations, the governments are also tightening up all the regulations. They've come out with mandatory spend targets, which they'll continue to look at and evaluate and ensure that, you know, in Alberta specifically, that they continue to drop their liability so that the taxpayers and, you know, the general public isn't left holding the bag on that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Another area that I heard when you were giving your introduction was around operational versus like inactive liabilities. So the concept of risk when an organization has a portfolio of both active operational facilities, but also orphan facilities or inactive facilities, which are liabilities on the books, which haven't necessarily been remediated yet. Maybe you could talk a little bit about where the opportunities are for you know, entrepreneurs to solve problems where the operations might be some specific problems, but the legacy issues are also significant. And those are going to become more significant in the future as we're starting to have more conversations about the environmental permitting process, having a bonding a process similar to what mines have. There needs to be an environmental bond such that at the closure of the facility, if it's abandoned financially, the taxpayers aren't paying for that remediation. There's a bond that pays for that. And there's discussions about that being extended among other sectors as well. So maybe you could talk a little bit about where those opportunities are on that legacy side as well as operational and how that differs.
I think on the legacy side, you know, it's really coming up with new technologies for remediation of different products. Hydrocarbons, we can do in situ treatments. Salts are very difficult to treat. And so, you know, is there a way or system that we could look at those chlorides or alternative metals so that it doesn't end up in a landfill and it's not a dig and dump? Looking at an in situ way of treating that or an on-site treatment would be super helpful. And then from a reclamation perspective, you know, we struggle depending on the land use with native prairie. You know, is there ways to get native prairie to grow where you're not waiting 10 years and looking at Mother Nature, peat farms, and trying to put peat back in the muskeg. Two very difficult items in there's not really a technology to do either one of those at this current point.
Mm-hmm. So those are some really great examples when you mentioned native prairie and muskeg. So a lot of the focus when people think about clean tech and climate solutions is very much hard tech focused around greenhouse gas emissions, but really we need solutions that are coming from biology and coming from chemistry, because we need to be able to have reclamation of sites. We need to be able to have habitat coming back so we can be supporting a healthy ecosystem. And so we need people coming with skill sets from a variety of different disciplines to be able to tackle these kinds of problems. So thanks for bringing that up. And the other piece that I think is really important is that issue around salt. So sodium chloride itself isn't necessarily toxic, although it can be toxic to plants. It doesn't have the same type of toxicity, but you may be doing this dig and dump, as you're saying. So if we had solutions to be able to do remediation in site for this, that could be really transformative. So again, we're not spending a huge amount of using a huge amount of fuel to actually transport one problem from one location to another.
Right.
Now, I want to move back over to Nigel to talk a little bit about this view on sort of legacy opportunities that could exist within legacy issues and how to reduce those risks.
Yeah, I think as companies and governments and markets start to understand the true total cost of projects, and building those costs in upfront and then mitigating those costs through technologies, of course, it just becomes a clearer picture really for everyone then to indeed work on the total cost of ownership, total cost of development, of energy provision, in order to give a lowest cost solution. And so rather than, historically, of course, in oil and gas, companies committing to abandoning a project at the end, and perhaps then transferring the ownership to other operators throughout, and then it basically being stuck with the last man standing, if you like. Indeed, putting financial provisions in upfront to make sure that there is the funding to do that. Of course, we have a lot of oil and gas legacy wells that still need to be abandoned, around the world. And particularly in North America, that now, of course, because historically that hasn't been done, there is a cost to society. And so, understanding what that cost is, and then being able to mitigate it potentially upfront or during operation. Therefore, total cost of development and total cost of ownership, total cost to society. Knowing what that is upfront, we can then adopt the right solutions.
Wonderful. That's a really great suggestion. And I was just thinking, as you were just sort of describing that, some of the models, investment models that companies like Shopify have been using, these large organizations that are signing on to greenhouse gas reduction emissions targets, but realizing that they don't have offsets that are high quality to buy. And so you end up with this chicken and the egg scenario where you have a deep science venture that's early stage, but it needs 10 million or 100 million to make the product to actually, or the service to actually sequester that carbon. And so the model that we've seen has been successful with some Vancouver-based companies recently, Carbon Engineering, Carbon Minerals, and others, has been to basically get a contract up front and to get some cash injection in order to build the solution. And that contract results in the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions or the sequestering of carbon.
It's a great point. People are understanding, planting a tree lasts for 20 years, and then basically you need to reinvest in that if you want to have continued benefits. So more permanent solutions, bio energy with CCS and direct air capture definitely have that quality, but they're not at the moment priced sufficiently in the marketplace, where a carbon offset is priced at, you know, anywhere between $3 and $5 a ton. It's the volume there that's controlling the price is in the planting of trees and protecting forests, etc. And how do those other new technologies that have more permanence actually be valued by the market? Indeed, you need companies that understand there needs to be what the longer term cost is. Indeed, like the Frontier, you see the Frontier announcement, which is indeed, you know, Microsoft or Alphabet and Meta and McKinsey's there, Shopify, Stripe, come together and really, you know, create their own market and their own investment into those technologies that will deliver the solution that they need over the longer term.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to build on that with a comment back to Jeremy. So, so we've seen these very large organizations that have a lot of procurement dollars that are able to do this kind of investment, as Nigel just described. Now, Jeremy, you're coming from a cooperative, and you've talked about how your membership can actually drive change even before the regulations are in place. So we need to have a bit of a trickle-down effect that not only are these big players that have big dollars are making these proactive moves, or they're actually considering the full total cost up front of these of their activities and that life cycle analysis, and knowing that that's a lot of the work that you're doing. What do you see sort of as a vision for the future of smaller entities that are more mission driven, like a cooperative, that could potentially play a role in that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, and I don't know if this will answer it or not, but you know, our business lines range from everything from agriculture to fertilizer to grocery to gas bar to, you know, we sort of cover a very wide range of business lines, and because of that, I think we're sort of positioned uniquely for, you know, our farm customers to be able to use renewable diesel from crops. Say they grow canola in their field, eventually we'll be able to turn that into renewable diesel, and they'll be able to use that back on farm. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but there is that opportunity to, you know, help farmers, you know, through our, we call it a grow team, where we have advisors go out and help farmers reduce their emissions on farm, which in turn helps us reduce the carbon intensity of the fuel that we'll produce in the end. And so just sort of that synergy and that partnership with our members to help them, you know, maybe they can generate credits based on their farming practices, and then we can benefit from those down the road in our life cycle assessment, because all of that is built into the carbon intensity of the final fuel we're producing. So that's just one sort of example that comes to mind.
Very good. So that's similar to the theme we were talking about before, is that if you can have transparency in your activities and what their impacts are, and if you're reducing those impacts and there's transparency as a way to communicate back to their own customers, that then reinforce that cycle because they have a stronger value proposition around providing something that's more sustainable. So that's really powerful. Thank you. I wanted to bring something back to Joanne. And that's along the thought of, you know, some of the activities that we're involved with in energy, they take up a lot of land space. And you have this long time period where you can have impacts to land over decades, and in some cases the legacy sites have been impacted for you know, over 100 years, depending on when industrial activity started. And then when you have contamination, for example, in water, and you've mentioned water scarcity and water contamination as being an issue, that can have really long-lasting effects. And in Canada, we're going through you know, a process of Indigenous reconciliation. And so I wanted you to talk a little bit about, because water and land are two things that are critically important, looking at climate justice and reconciliation in Canada. How have you thought about sort of economic reconciliation? And is that something that is being discussed sort of in the corporate board level of some of your activities, along with the climate work?
Yeah, so I think they all kind of tie together, Shannon. We're definitely looking to do pad sites. So you've got a number of wells on a pad site. So your disturbance to the land is less. You've got one pipeline coming in, one road coming in versus various roads and pipelines, and less disturbance on that front. Less disturbance and less emissions on that scope 3 and internally on that scope 1 by doing that. Also looking at interim reclamation, as these sites are there for a long time, so you need a larger land base for drilling and completions operations. And when you're done that, being able to pull that back and plant the trees around that teardrop so that you've got that interim reclamation happening as well.
Very good. Now we've got a question for the audience here that's related to this. How important, this is from Stanley Lee. Stanley, actually, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question yourself? Just give you a moment to unmute yourself.
Sure thing. I'm just reopening my chat window because I forgot my question. So my question is, how important is public consultation of the land management, given what Shannon mentioned? But given the urgency of the issues, how do you do it in such a way that you're not slowing down too much because of the timelines that we're talking about? Thanks.
Joanne, do you want to comment on that first?
We're trying to be really proactive in getting in front of that land management and our stakeholders to ensure that we have them on side prior to, and so that it's not a rush. And a lot of these projects are long lead projects, so we have the time to engage all our stakeholders and ensure that we've addressed their concerns.
Thank you. Nigel, you look like you wanted to say something.
I'll double down on that answer from Joanne, that it's really about making sure that the process of local stakeholders and their engagement starts early enough, because a project in the implementation project, we've learned, I think the industrial landscape, we've learned to do it earlier and earlier within the process, to give it enough time rather than it being, basically something that's just added on after we've made a financial investment decision in a project. It's now done way up front, during, really after feasibility. Once it comes out of feasibility, we start to then look at what, the location, getting environmental baselines, etc. You've got to go out and engage the local stakeholders and other stakeholders, of course, as well, in the activity that is being planned. So yeah, just making sure that we have enough time for it. Mm-hmm. Proactively.
And I think the analogy is very similar to the health and safety disasters. The changes in behavior corporately didn't happen until there was a disaster. Well, how many blockades do you need, and the cost of that, and delays of months or years before you realize that consultation piece can be very important, to be proactive and have people on board and co-develop what the project is going to be, and have wealth stay in the community. Jeremy, would you like to contribute to this discussion?
I think Nigel and Joanne knocked that one out of the park, so I'll leave it there.
Fantastic. I wanted to segue into another area, which is around accelerating adoption and new solutions. So we've talked a little bit about regulations, and one of the challenges can be that existing environmental regulations, not only can changes in regulations create new markets, but existing regulations can in fact discriminate against or create involuntarily create barriers against adoption of new technologies in some cases, without the regulators even realizing it. It's not often until you start to investigate that you realize, actually, because there's only 3 approved technologies to do this, to get this permit, anything new is prohibited just by the nature of that. And so I wondered if people could sort of talk about whether they'd had experience with that, if they had some advice they could give to some of our people in the audience that may be starting to face that. And Nigel, I saw you nodding your head first, so I'm gonna pass it to you first.
Definitely seen it. Sort of in various areas. I'll give some examples around carbon capture, where in order to incentivize a technology back in the 90s, a lot of the US regulations were written in focused on that technology. It was on gasification, on coal, so fuel source coal. Technology gasification, and you therefore need to have both of those things in order to do a CCS project and actually get permitting for CO2 storage in offshore waters. All other fuel sources, source of CO2 emissions, technology that's used to capture the CO2, basically because of that way that it was written, which was technology focused at the time, you know, the unintended consequences were that everything else couldn't be done, and that wasn't the intent. But yeah, they're all over the place. So my always advice is to write them with the end result in mind. That the end result is emissions reductions, and that is what we need to regulate and incentivize lowering of.
Good.
And let the market, you know, decide how to get there in the lowest cost and most safest mechanism.
Mm-hmm. And Nigel, do you have some advice on how an early stage entrepreneur could become part of that process, to be able to do that type of engagement, to help voice that there actually is a problem here and to get it changed? What would your advice be?
Oh, yeah. Gosh, that's a good, I would say engage, you know, groups and bodies that, that would of course be interested, but you need to raise the issue up to a level where it can be heard amongst other voices, of course. And so, yeah, finding a broad coalition that can engage in the issue and understand it, to take it forward so it can be properly heard and recognized, and everything else that's going on is probably the most important thing to do. So I saw in this example that I gave, I saw it because I was trying to do some project development. It was an impasse. We tried to fix it as a company, couldn't get traction, even though I worked at a multinational. And we then tried in a trade association focused on the technology. That didn't work. It only really got heard and recognized and now being actioned once it was raised up to a multi-sector, NGOs involved, as well as multiple trade associations, multiple companies, really as being a problem that needed to be fixed as soon as possible. So yeah.
Well, that's great. I'm just going to add on to that where I've seen it be quite successful is being active in different professional associations and in things like the business councils. So Business Council of British Columbia, or wherever your regional business council is. The reason why is that they have a team that does government regulatory engagement, and they bring in the regulators to meetings where they specifically hold forums to talk about these issues. And they will do this a year or 6 months before there's any change in regulations. So if you can, sometimes you have to pay membership fees to join these organizations, but it is a really great way to get your voice heard in that. And now, Jeremy and Joanne, did you have anything to add on to this?
Yeah, I would say in the upstream oil and gas world, there's lots of working groups, and they're working with the regulators, especially on emissions reductions, and trying to make those regulations align, but not put too many stipulations on the technology. So I think they've learned a lot from past mistakes, and they're trying to broaden that scope and leave that a bit more wider, like Nigel said, where the end goal is reduction.
Jeremy.
Yeah, I'll just quickly echo, those comments. We've even, in the last 2 years during the federal government's process for the rolling out the clean fuels regulations, we've seen, industry associations and other organizations like that bring forward some of their concerns about the impending regulations, and we've seen them actually in some cases, you know, actually make change. I mean, obviously you're not going to get everything you ask for, but if you can get that channel in and have those conversations with them, at least you give yourself a shot.
Now, I'm just going to, before we're going to move to the breakout room, I have one last question, because we've been talking about changes in markets, pressures from ESG coming from investors, coming from customers, coming from the corporation, and thinking about the whole cradle to grave aspects of your projects, and how the regulatory regime can play a role in that. But one thing we haven't addressed is when there are global events that happen that are out of your control, that were unexpected, like, for example, the war in Ukraine. And so are there, with the situation that we have in the world right now, do you see a way that could be an opportunity to get adoption of new climate solutions? And I'll throw it at you, Nigel, first.
I mean, it definitely impacts decision making, and choices that you know, are being made, and of course, energy security. You know, I guess I've seen come and go by, you know, in a focus, you know, for other things, but to me, sustainability is, you know, is of course multifaceted, and having a sustainable policy and energy choice means looking at various aspects to it. It doesn't mean solely environmental. It also, you know, you need to make sure that there's social justice, environmental justice, but also energy justice, and address energy poverty and issues within the current energy system. And I think, yeah, those what happens in the world around things are basically due to a lack of sustainability in one area, and they'll result in, yeah, people, you know, wanting to try and get market share, you know, wars, famine, hunger, you know, et cetera. But if we get back to a sustainable, multifaceted approach, those disruptions will stop happening. But certainly, you know, Ukraine is, you know, due to some policy decisions that have been made that perhaps weren't sustainable in the region and things, and of course, yeah, I'd hate to call it an opportunity, because of what's happening there, which is of course terrible. But yeah, it's certainly causing a reassessment of decisions that have been made around energy policy historically.
So we actually have one question that has come in from the audience. If one pain point could be solved today, what would it be? And maybe I'll pass that around to each person. So Nigel, maybe you make a response, then we'll go to Jeremy and give Joanne the last word.
Pain point. I'd say, pain point of, I would say, access. The pain point of access really being access to understanding, knowledge, and solutions is a pain point still. With this, I think society is opening up with the internet and communication tools we have, etc. But there's still, you know, a somewhat of an isolation there. So breaking down isolation and getting access is important.
Over to you, Jeremy.
Oh man, that's a tough question. How to answer that one? Pain point. I think maybe sort of, as we've talked about a little bit already, but just those unintended consequences, I think, are something that, you know, was when Nigel was talking earlier. I mean, for us in the low carbon fuels, those unintended consequences can be, you know, all of a sudden people are like, oh, we can grow canola and get more money for it because now it's being used as a fuel crop. So then, you know, whether the unintended consequences, forests get bulldozed or different crops get planted, I think that can really have an impact on a lot of things, and maybe even increase emissions in the long term. So just you know, when that problem sort of comes to light, I mean, maybe it's impossible or naive to think you can, you know, foresee all of the unintended consequences, but doing your best to sort of keep that in mind as you're making decisions.
Thank you, Jeremy. And Joanne, over to you for the last word.
I think, you know, a pain point outside of what Jeremy and Nigel said is just having the technology accessible. And, you know, Nigel alluded to it in his, is that we don't have solutions to a lot of these problems currently. We don't have, you know, a ton of CCS projects that we can take out all this carbon, and the technology is not quite caught up. If you look at big boilers at big plant sites, we could electrify our plant, but we can't take out our boilers. So we're still burning, you know, fuels to do that. And so we still create emissions. So the technology is not currently there. We've got big ambitions. You know, the global has big ambitions to reduce emissions. But part of that is to have that technology catch up. And that's probably one of our biggest pain points, is that we don't have a solution.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joanne. So I'm going to pass it back to Stephen, who's going to give instructions for the next part of the session. Thanks, Stephen.
Absolutely. Thank you, Shannon. Next, we're going to go to one of my favorite parts, which is the breakout rooms. What we're going to do is we're going to put each of those panelists, Jeremy, Nigel, and Joanne, into a breakout room. You will get to select which one you want to go talk to a little bit more. Do you want to talk to Jeremy about the kind of life cycle assessments that he was talking about earlier, Nigel around hydrogen storage, or Joanne around the kind of produced water and reducing the amount of fresh water used in their processes, as well as they touched on a number of other challenges. I mean, Joanne was just sort of talking about the lack of solutions around everything from electrification, replacing boilers, to the kind of other points made. So lots of things touched on, lots of areas of interest. We'll be doing this for the next 25 minutes. And I believe Lee will open up those breakout rooms now. All right, everybody, welcome back. I hope you had some wonderful chats in the breakout rooms, got to know some of the people who were on the call, got to ask some specific questions, learn a little bit more from our panelists. I do want to say thank you again to Nigel, Jeremy, and Joanne for taking a little bit of their time to tell us what their kind of organizations are seeing as they kind of look to the future and continue to develop solutions, and, you know, feel increased pressures on the ESG requirements that they're facing. What are some of the areas that they would love to see solved? So thank you again for taking your time and being here today. I do want to say thank you as well to the fabulous moderator, Shannon Bard, who did a wonderful job. Next up, next month, we're doing one on ag. Same sort of format, 3 industrial users and the challenges that they're facing in the ag space. June 22nd, register online at foresight.com, cac.com/events. We'll be taking a break through July and August. We'll be returning with another one focused on energy in the fall. We will be doing these monthly again through the fall on a variety of topics, rolling through water, carbon, energy, ag, and the built environment. Thank you, everybody. I hope you have a fabulous rest of your day.